So, firstly, I'd like to thank the York University Global Labor Research Center and the organizing committee of this symposium for organizing this symposium this year and giving me the opportunity to represent and discuss my research work with all of you. So this is Lovepreet Kaur. I'm a visiting scholar at Center for Feminist Research at York University and also the upcoming associate of the Global Labor Research Center at York. In today's presentation, I'm going to talk about employment rights of LGBT, specifically employment rights of LGBT in India. So I'd like to begin my presentation with the words of Alan G. Berrier. We are not always going to agree with each other, but we should have the dignity to always respect each other's freedom of speech and of choice. Democracy is practiced when we have respect for each other's human rights. So on this note, let me talk about homosexuality. What is this section, homosexuality? This section was firstly enacted in the year 1860 by the British government during the colonial time. So section 377 was introduced as an offense under this section. Homosexual conduct was criminalized by the British rule. Until 2001, this section wasn't challenged. This section was firstly challenged in the case of Nas Foundation versus Government of NCT Delhi. I'm just giving a brief background of what this homosexuality, this section is, and what is the effort being put in by the Indian judiciary to decriminalize this section. So after challenging the provision of this section 377, in 2003, the Delhi High Court dismisses this plea. But the Supreme Court of India in 2009 asked the Delhi High Court to reconsider the plea, and then Delhi High Court declared section 377 as unconstitutional and said that yes, it is in violation to Article 14, 15, 16, and 21 of the Constitution. But just after 3-4 years, in the year 2013, in this case of Suresh Kumar Kaushal versus the Nas Foundation, homosexuality was recriminalized in India and said that, yes, it is illegal, it is prohibited. Again, the very next year in 2014, the National Legal Service Authority versus Union of India, in this case, court first time recognizes that, yes, it is the right of every Indian citizen to choose their gender identity either as a male, female, or as a third gender. Later on, in the case of Justice Retired K.S. Puttaswamy versus Union of India, members of LGBT community has chosen, it was said that they has right to privacy and protection from state action while expressing their right to choose their partners in private. It's none of the state's business what they're doing in private. And lastly, in 2018, in this landmark judgment of Navteej Singh Johar versus Union of India, homosexuality was finally decriminalized in India, and Supreme Court said that yes, it is in violation to Article 14 that talks about equality, 15 that talks about prohibition of discrimination, 16 that specifically talks about employment, and Article 19 that talks about freedom of speech and expression of the Constitution of India. Now coming to my main topic of today's discussion, employment rights of LGBT in India. Lesbian, gays, bisexual, and transgender individuals, they do not enjoy the safeguards, like they do not enjoy the protection from discrimination, and discrimination still exists at workplace. Harassment at workplace affects both individual as well as Indian economy. A significant human rights issue in India, in the absence of state assistance for a lesbian, gays, bisexual community, arisen employment difficulty for them. A range of sexualities has existed since at least the ancient and medieval India, but the government has not treated LGBT people with respect and dignity as they do the heterosexuals in India. Despite the fact that sex-based discrimination is prohibited by the Indian Constitution, LGBT in India, they have not received this protection, not till yet. They haven't received the protection entitled by the Indian Constitution. The constitutional prohibition against discrimination on the basis of sex, it was gradually expanded by the Supreme Court of India, as I have discussed in the National Legal Service Authority versus Union of India case, and to encompasses discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. The court in that case noted that such discrimination against those who do not fit within the traditional assumption of binary gender it violates the Constitution's protection of fundamental right to equality. And after that, 4 years later, in the Navtej Singh Johar versus Union of India, the Supreme Court acknowledged that the capacity to recognize and the capacity and freedom to select and self-defined sexual orientation and gender expression, including the way to dress, the manner, the way in which you speak the language, these are all the foundation of one's own identity. Nevertheless, consider that India's LGBT community, it continues to face workplace harassment and economic exclusion in their daily lives. Right now, if we see, India has a number of regulations in place to stop discrimination based on gender and sexual orientation. However, I can clearly say that there is a still long way to go until prejudice against LGBTQ plus community is eliminated. But the question is, how we can get there, what we need to do, how we can reach the target. This is what I have discussed in my research. I have discussed that now various laws we have in place to protect the rights of LGBTQ plus population in India and to provide equal opportunity in employment and all public matters. So the reality in workplace, it differs. There are numerous regulations in place, but much work has to be done to improve inclusivity and visibility. These two things, inclusivity and visibility in the workplaces, and also to address embedded biases. Now, firstly, discussing this point, inadequate LGBT rights protection in the workplace, the harassment of LGBT at work is not a new concept. They have encountered a variety of forms of harassment at work, including insensitive small talk, any sort of homophobic jokes, insult, sexual insult, derogatory reference to a person's sexual orientation, and even total exclusion. So it might be difficult for someone whose name and gender have been changed in the official records just to land a job. Additionally, law enforcement organizations and other players in the criminal justice system, they continue to harass, mistreat, and persecute them in public areas. In addition to the apparent harassment, LGBT workers may also encounter implicit prejudice. And despite the fact that recently Supreme Court ruling they now protect public employees from discrimination, employees in reality, they are not treated and are entitled to the same constitutional protection as the heterosexuals they are entitled to. So the rights of LGBT, they are not taken into account in the current workplace harassment regulation, or for that matter, in any regulation. They are particularly vulnerable to economic exclusion due to the societal stigma associated with LGBT rights. The dominance of cisgendered male and higher socioeconomic groups in the workplace and other social factors. Many members of transgender community in India, they rely on some sort of other method for their own survival in this country. Now, discussing the second point, that is stigmatization at work and economic loss. There are dangerous repercussions for India if the LGBT community is not provided with the proper working benefit. What I mean to say, why the proper working benefit? It was discovered that a variety of homophobic behavior caused India to suffer greatly since LGBT individuals have higher health and social costs, as well as a reduced labor force participation and economic production. So by publishing some sort of gender neutral job description, offering gender neutral restrooms, or giving paid leaves, or giving some medical benefits, and also providing health insurances, several firms and human resource departments in India have also set some good precedents by taking such action. Other places of employment also provide routine counseling sessions, support group, and different diversity techniques. But employers, however, they are the only one who decide whether to offer these protections to LGBT community at workplace or not. So in my research, inclusive workplaces function better than others. And prejudice against LGBT individuals, including indirect discrimination, a lack of accessible housing, all these things sort of have a negative impact on the economic outcome, and it also decreases workplace productivity. So increasing transparency and honesty in hiring practices, it can also aid alter societal norms at work. Now, in the next slide, I'll be talking about these 2 points, which is number one is promoting and advocating for a comprehensive equality law. Now, in the previous slide of indigeneity and homosexuality, I've discussed some provision of Indian Constitution that talks about, which we can say, fundamental rights. In that, one article is Article 16 that talks about employment opportunities, and it is equally available to all the people. And Article 15 that talks about non-discrimination. So these constitutional protection, however, only applies to public sector discrimination, and LGBT Indian employees, they have little redress, I would say, when their rights are being infringed by employers, because the current law do not define what these rights would entail if employers, they violate them. A broad and comprehensive equality bill, it was recently being written by the Center for Law and Public Policy Research in 2019, and to fill the gaps which are being left by the earlier legislation. And this bill also suggests for establishing equality court and designated district court with exclusive jurisdiction over case involving infringement of its provision and authority to grant civil remedies. And if properly operationalized with judicial officers who have received a prior training and sensitization, such equality courts specifically designed for the LGBT people, these courts can help and develop, expand existing equality jurisprudence, and also to fill gaps in precedents which are still left. Next, talking about the COVID-19 pandemic and how it has impacted the workplace employees. The COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the horrifying workplace discrimination that the poor, particularly the migrant worker, contract worker, healthcare professional, and transgender people, they have encountered. So if equality bill becomes law, it can assist in eradicating severe inequalities in the employment sector by addressing such issues. Lastly, talking about the future direction, I would say that the Supreme Court left the door open for the people to challenge anti-LGBT employee practices in the employment sector by highlighting the need to embrace an intersectional understanding of how discrimination operates. And if I would say that there is a crucial need to alter attitudes and foster better acceptance of LGBT individuals everywhere. And with the legalization of homosexuality and increased awareness and sensitivity to LGBT issues in India, this movement is gaining the ground. And passage of an anti-discrimination bill by the parliament will unquestionably be a positive move. So when I say passing a bill is important, but it is the high time, and right now there is a need to enact a specific legislation to safeguard members of LGBTQ community. The legislation specify a number of recommendations for the creation of onboarding and offboarding rule. And the approach of law should be to establish a comprehensive document that establish any potential gray areas in terms of protection and imposition of fine. Lastly, in the end, I'd like to say that I'm saying that passing the law is important, but however, merely passing the law won't make life better for the LGBT Indians. I agree. We must first wage a difficult struggle by eradicating our ingrained prejudice towards alternative sexuality and other gender identities. And in order to assure the LGBT communities actually accepted in the workplace across India. Lastly, I'd like to end my presentation with a note of hope that they need a world where their families no longer owe them, where society treats them as equal, and where government guarantees their rights, a world that understands the identity of LGBT community. And thank you so much. And regarding the feedback, I'm open to all sort of comments, because I know that all they are going to be really helpful in my research. Thank you. I'll stop in the screen. Thank you. I hope I adhere to the time limit.
I have started my second year in doctoral studies at York University at the School of Social Work. So this is an ongoing and developing framework for me. So it's very much a work in progress. So let's get back. So this is the key question that I'm working on, which is how does neoliberal capitalism mediates or intervenes to commodify trans and queer refugee bodies in the context of re-sexualized and Canadianizing identity politics? A lot of words there, but the key is re-sexualizing and Canadianizing in identity politics. This study I find very important because this is a form of assimilation of queer refugees into sexual citizenship that masks Canada's unending settler violence against the First Peoples, and that is deemed as genocide. First Peoples, Indigenous peoples. And it exposes how issues of social justice is polarized, mediated, and infused into public consciousness. And also it forces us to see how capital over labor becomes hegemonic, ideological in this great society of the spectacle, famously as Guy Debord says, in which societies where modern conditions of production prevail, all life presents itself as an immense accumulation of spectacles. Everything that was directly lived has moved away into a representation. That is the opening paragraph of Guy Debord's book, The Society of the Spectacle. Now, these are the contested terrains on which I'm highlighting, the contested terrains. For example, Canada was the fourth country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage. Same-sex marriage in 1991, it became the first Western nation to accept refugees based on their sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. SOGI, Canada's international reputation as a safe haven for queer refugees who continue to flee to Canada, and chronic underfunding of community agencies that support queer refugees, complexity and the urgency of queer refugee resettlement because of their past trauma and the life-crushing new challenges they face in Canada. So these are some of the contested terrains, which I can come back to if there is time. And the picture shows here how Canada celebrated in 2017 the Great Canada 150 and the flag raising of the three flags, trans flag, the LGBTQ flag, rainbow flag, and the Rainbow Canada 150 flag. And this denotes how queerness is absorbed into reforming and legitimizing a kind of citizenship, which I call, based on Morgeson and others, sexual citizenship, sexualized citizenship to fortify Canadian nationhood, settlerhood. So these are some of the inherent paradoxes. When LGBTQ plus refugees and newcomers, and I will call them queer interchangeably, they come with high expectations. The expectation is a safe haven. But actual experiences are completely different. They face transphobia, homophobia from their own straight communities. So they cannot go back to their ethno-racial communities. I am a gay man. I came from Sri Lanka because I'm gay, and I cannot go back to my so-called ethno-racial community, the Sinhalese community, because of my sexual orientation. And this is same for all LGBTQ plus refugees and newcomers. Racism, so while there is homophobia and transphobia from their ethno-racial communities mainly, there is racism from the mainstream LGBTQ plus communities. And that is where personally I felt I had my most horrifying racist incidents. And then they face abject poverty, there's social isolation, unsafe housing, which is a huge issue, lack of access to equitable healthcare and education, leading these precarious nature of their existence, then leading to precarious employment. And that is where their labor is grossly exploited. So this is again the inherent paradoxes. So there is the safe haven carrot to exploit and extract labor from the disposable bodies, queer and trans bodies, and they come from the queer refugee producing geographies to the safe haven branding, ports of entries, arrested, deported, or allowed in, and there is the long, steep ladder towards becoming a Canadian homo-nationalist citizen. Asylum seeker to refugee claimant to convention refugee permanent resident to Canadian citizen, which is an establishment of homo-nationalist sexuality-based citizenship. And this process is then implicated in the ongoing genocide of indigenous peoples. So this is the tall ladder to safe haven. So this is basically, I'm exposing some inherent paradoxes here. And again, inherent paradoxes, I will just read the last quote. This is Lohman and Barker in 2015. Canada as a nation and a state is dependent on the land taken from indigenous nations. Land that those nations still contest. Colonialism is about the need to secure those land at all costs. Canada has essentially no legal ground for its own sovereignty, which is to say, no reason in law as to why Canadian territory should be Canada's to govern. And alongside this, we saw the Pope coming to apologize, but conditional apologies and all that. So, and this is again really under-discussed and hidden paradox. Now, if you look at these two definitions of genocide as defined by the United Nations, and then the Government Canada definition. So I highlighted the identical segments. So what Government of Canada has seemingly has done is to copy and paste and delete conveniently certain segments, crucial segments of the Union definition, so that it can conveniently hide away the ongoing dispossession and genocide of indigenous peoples. Item B, on the left-hand side, causing serious bodily harm and mental harm to members of the group is hidden away, erased, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children from the group to another group. This is UN definition, and that is hidden away. So only A and B are mentioned in partial. So these are the inherent paradoxes. So in order to look at the LGBTQ refugee resettlement, I am of the opinion that I need to situate the refugee resettlement on the land that is being stolen from indigenous nations. Otherwise, I am being implicated in the legitimization of settler colonialism and genocide. So I have I am exploring Marxist, feminist, post-colonial, and critical race theory. From Marxist theory, I can particularly look at the Marxist theory in the context that the exploitation of labor underscores the machinery of Canada's safe haven branding and its underlying luring of the racialized queer other into the country, making Marxist theory imperative for my study. Wolff, 2019, famously situated the queer oppression as one of modern capitalism's numerous contradictions. Capitalism, while creating material grounds for people to spend independent sexual lives, regulates economic, social, and sexual order through its heteronormative yardsticks. Labor is transformed into a commodity to be bought and sold for profit. Similar to racism and sexism, homophobia and transphobia are manipulative divisions of the working class. So these are some of the things that I'm positing here. And then Carly in 2007 explained that social institution, the family, as a social institution, the family has always been utilized to integrate sexuality into class societies in which rigid sex norms were established. Even though gender and sexuality are fluid phenomena, cis heteropatriarchal norms make them appear to be fixed and pushed aside as the deviant other with the advent of the morality or morally coded nuclear family. So I'm hoping to utilize Marxist theory to critique commodification of the refugee queer other through the regulatory mechanisms of settler homonationalism in order to unleash them to the market. So similarly, feminist, postcolonial, and critical race theories, which I can come later. Okay, so these are some of the emerging themes. As I mentioned before, the paradox of safe haven. Safe haven denotes safety, full inclusion, versus the traumatic nature of queer refugee claim processes. And this paradox also of safe haven also ties to Canada's settler colonial cis heteropatriarchal nationhood. Let me read the sections. Yes, the notion of safe haven denotes safety and full inclusion in the social production. It entails legal, institutional, social, economic, political, and spiritual frameworks which accept queer refugees as full human beings. Predictably, the Government of Canada has highlighted Canada's proud history of granting protection and assisting in the resettling of the world's most vulnerable groups, including 2S LGBTQ+ communities. However, the tedious and traumatic nature of the queer refugee claim process, prolonged wait times, funding cuts to refugee resettlement, I'm quoting Moulet, and Gamble, the 519, and so on, leading to the precarity of queer refugee claimants' lives, are conveniently missing from the safe haven rhetoric. This narrative alongside its underlying queer refugee resettlement machinery are closely tied to Canada's settler colonial and cis heteropatriarchal national identity, which of course is driven by the tenets of free market capitalism. Murray 2016 and Kingspan 2018 famously mentioned. Okay, homonationalism and requeering the already other. So queer, P-U-A-R, queer, 2007 and 2013 contextualized the gay-friendly global geographies from Israel to different European states to colonial North America in order to explain the benefactors of homonationalism and their inherent kinship with settler colonialism. In doing so, she critiqued the repositioning of the liberalized queer, both as a necessary force to justify the fight against the Islamic terror and its subtext to neoliberal capitalist accumulation. Exposing white supremacy in the Toronto Pride Parade, Da Costa 2020 argued that homonationalism is hegemonized in Canada. That, I quote, temporalizes queer consciousness according to the same racist politics of freedom that constitute late Western modernity, pages 443 to 444. And other scholars like Greensmith and Kiva 2013 highlighted that the elimination logic of white settler colonialism, while dictating terms on indigenous peoples, is deployed to recondition queer and trans communities into white normative same-sex politics and practices. This has led to the proliferation of a normative queer rights discourse that has added to the globalized human rights industrial complex. Peaking with same-sex marriage, the portrayal of Canada as safe haven for queer refugees emerged from this context, positing an undisputable remedy for racialized queer other. It is expected that they constantly civilize themselves, including myself, by becoming respectable and legalized homonationalists. Thus, liberalism, I quote, is re-inscribed and many times trafficked in the discourses of sexuality, gay and post-gayness. This is Rebecca and Upadhyay in 2013, page 359. So meanwhile, what happens is on stolen land, settler homonationalism is the mechanism by which sexual colonization of indigenous peoples is redeployed to form modern settler queer subjects. Projects. Morganson, 2010, called this as the biopolitics of the modern sexuality, produced by colonization as settler sexuality, a white nationalist homonormativity that regulates indigenous sexuality and gender by supplanting them with the sexual modernity of settler subjects. So similarly, settler colonialism is another key theme that emerged, and another theme is the stolen land and genocide. Settler colonialism I have briefly mentioned, but what is important is to also identify settler colonialism as a structure. It is integral to the logic of eliminating the indigenous to grab land. It destroys to replace. Wolf, 2006, page 388. And it differs from colonialism. So there is a difference between settler colonialism and colonialism. Verasini, 2011, stating that whereas colonialism reinforces the distinction between colony and metropole, settler colonialism erases it. Quoting Wolf, 2016, she adds that settler invasion is a structure and not an event. Colonialism reproduces itself. Settler colonialism extinguishes itself. And this is so important for me to identify the differences, because in the settler colonial colonization process, what happens is the settlers acquire the center, while the racialized other and the indigenous peoples becomes the other, the periphery. Quite often, the headache to get rid of. And stolen land of genocide people and genocide is another theme that is emerged, which I'm not going to talk about in detail right now. And it leads to my final slide, which is about hypotheses that I am developing. So there is recolonization of the queer other, LGBTQ plus refugees, whilst there is settler colonization of indigenous peoples. So hypothesis one, first and foremost, a theme of governance and regulation of both indigenous peoples and LGBTQ plus refugees have emerged. As many scholars pointed out, indigenous peoples are regulated, including through the Indian Act, which does not even recognize indigenous peoples as fully human. Cardinal 1999 and Wawal 2016 illustrated the exclusion and the structural erasure of indigenous women and two-spirit people from the colonial structures of power. Attacks on these pillars of indigenous social fabric shows the gendered and sexualized nature of colonial violence. Mule 2020 highlighted that being pushed into accepting the dominant Western understanding of sexual identities and the essentialist binary notion of gender denotes recolonization of queer refugees. Only when historicizing LGBTQ plus refugees being produced predominantly by the former colonies was I able to capture the commonalities of the neo-colonial sexualized and gendered violence against them and indigenous peoples. From the insights gained through the literature review that I'm doing, I can now situate such commonalities maneuvered by what Chapman and Withers called in 2019 cis heteropatriarchalization. It's a big word. Cis heteropatriarchalization that denotes the many terrains on which structure of dominance, the nuclear family, gender binary, racist, classist, orderings of gender, sex, morality, and eugenics operate. And they mentioned that it is at the paternalistic, normalizing, standardized means of intervening in other people's lives.
Sorry.
Okay, so I'll stop
wrapping up
here.
because-
That's, yeah. So the other points are exploitation of labor and land and liberalized justice as the spectacle. So which I can come back to, but this is it. Thank you so much. And this is Queer Progress as many workings of capitalism, LGBTQ for Trump we saw, and from transphobia, homophobia to homo nationalism, queers for Trump to freedom convoy. And this is my final slide. Harvey 2004 famously mentioned accumulation by disposition. One is mechanisms of surveillance, social work, the police, refugee process, and settler colonialism. And I'm positing that capitalism as a hegemonic ideology puts everyone to work spectacularly and allows the capitalist class to reap harvest. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Janice Lamb, and I'm excited today to be presenting my work with Drs. Ivona Hideg, Janine Bosak, and Madeline Heilman on male allyship. Sorry, my slides are not moving. There we go. So as mentioned, I'll be discussing male advocates for gender equality. As you may or may not know, gender equality remains a key challenge in Canada. And because of this, many organizations have been calling and looking to increase and strengthen factors that may promote this. One of these in the last few years has been the role that male advocates may play. Featured on my right is Tom Hiddleston, a British actor. He participated in the United Nations He for She movement. And a reason that...
Your slide, are you showing the second slide? Because we can only see the first slide.
Okay, so yeah, that's what I was worried about happening. One moment, I'll just share my desktop then. Apologies for that. Thank you for letting me know. Just forgive how you're going to see everything momentarily. So this is where I left off. Gender equality remains a key challenge in Canada. And because of this, people have been looking to strengthen and increase factors that may create progress, one of this being the role that male advocates may play. And a reason that people are looking towards men particularly is that research has shown that men may be particularly effective in garnering support for the movement. Specifically, there's research showing that when a male leader compared to a female leader speaks about gender equality, audience members are particularly more likely to show collective action intentions. So given this, it makes sense that people are looking at the role that male advocates can play. And given such, it's also important to consider then, how do we encourage men to act as allies for gender equality, and what may be preventing them from doing so? One of the things that men have reported is that they worry that if they are known to be advocates for gender equality, that they will face negative consequences, particularly with their careers. And indeed, there is some research showing that when men are seen to act in gender atypical ways, this may impact others' perceptions of them negatively, and this may lead to negative reactions in the workplace. However, other research disagrees with this. That is, there is some research showing that men are rewarded when they're enacting helping behaviors. And helping behaviors are not particularly necessarily expected of men, and allyship can be considered a helping behavior in some way. Furthermore, recent research shows that when people are involved in diversity initiatives and they are not seen as belonging to the beneficiary group, they do not receive negative outcomes. That is, only those who are seen as potential beneficiaries who are involved in these initiatives were shown to receive negative outcomes. So given there's this conflict in findings between research with whether men may or may not be impacted negatively, it was important to us to figure out how are men known as advocates for gender equality perceived and reacted towards in the workplace? And why are they reacted that way, towards that way? So we draw on social role theory and expectancy violation theory to consider the following. First, we consider the fact that there are gender stereotypes at play. Men are often associated with agency, which is a set of traits that are considered competence and assertiveness. Meanwhile, women are often associated with communality, which is regarding caring and being sensitive to the needs of others. So, as I kind of alluded to before, when men are known as advocates for gender equality, they may be seen as being helpful and caring, and this therefore would lead to them being perceived as potentially more communal. And part of the reason we say that men may be seen as more helpful and therefore more communal when they're known as advocates for gender equality is the fact that many people see men, when they are involved in these initiatives, to be helping others. They're not seen as benefiting themselves. Now, as I've mentioned just now, communality is often associated with women. Given this, it's not necessarily expected of men. Yet communality is not a bad thing. No one is going to say anything bad about someone being helpful, someone being caring, etc. Given this, given that it would be a man showing this would be seen as a positive stereotype violation. And according to expectancy violation theory, when one violates a stereotype positively, they will similarly be reacted to positively by others. So in this case, we are considering that when men are known as allies, they may be perceived as more communal, and therefore they will be received more positively. We particularly think that this will be manifesting with career-related outcomes in the workplace. This stems from the fact that communality is a valued trait, particularly within leaders. And recent work has shown that when men demonstrate communality, particularly, they are seen to be more promotable than men who do not show this communality. Hence, to summarize my theorizing, we are hypothesizing that when men are known as advocates for gender equality versus when they are not known to be, they will be perceived as more communal, and this in turn will lead to more positive career outcomes. So similar to what I was saying before, we would consider they might be seen as more effective leaders, more promotable, and they might be recommended for more career-related rewards and recommended for less career-related penalties. So we have these hypotheses, and we decided to test these in 2 studies. For the first study, this was an exploratory study, and we recruited 600 undergraduate Canadian business students. So these are undergraduate students, but they do have work experience. They were participating in the cooperative work program. And we recruited 600. All 600 received course credit for their participation. We had a final sample of 396 based on exclusion criteria, which I'm happy to discuss more later on. Out of this 396, 35.6 identified as men, 62.9 identified as women, and 0.8% identified as being non-binary, 52.5% identified as white, and on average, they were 20.07 years old with 2.72 years of work experience. So with this final sample of 396, we ran our analyses. Well, actually, before we ran our analyses, we had them complete the study, which I'm going to discuss now. Participants participated in a 2x3 between subjects experiment. So in this experiment, participants were shown a job application in which we manipulated the gender of the applicant. They either saw a man applying for a job or a woman applying for a job. Then, as part of this application, they saw feedback from a coworker, and this was where we manipulated advocacy. That is, participants saw that the applicants were either involved in the Equality and Diversity Committee, the Environmental Committee, or there was no information about advocacy. Part of why we had that environmental condition was just to rule out whether they were general effects of advocacy or whether it would be advocacy for gender equality specifically that led to more perceived communality. After participants saw this job application and feedback, they then rated the applicant on several measures regarding communality, as well as promotability, leadership effectiveness, reward recommendations, and penalty recommendations. So now we get to the analyses. So we ran an ANOVA with seeing how people rated the different applicants on communality. And as you can see here, with the male applicants, those who were advocating for gender equality were rated the highest on communality, and this was significantly more than those who were shown to be advocating for the environment or not known to be advocates. This pattern was not the same for women. Specifically, for women, when they were shown as gender equality advocates, they were seen as similarly communal to those who are not advocates. And meanwhile, those who advocated for the environment were seen as the most communal. Now, as this project focuses on male advocates for gender equality, our mediation analyses focus on our male applicant conditions. Furthermore, given our focus was on gender equality versus not being an advocate, we compared those conditions. So we ran mediation analyses in SPSS, and we saw that when one was a male advocate for gender equality versus being a male applicant not known for any advocacy, this led to increased perceived communality and turned into more positive career outcomes. That is, there were significant indirect effects. One was seen as more promotable, one was seen as a more effective leader, one was recommended for more rewards, and one was recommended for less penalties. Therefore, our hypotheses were supported in this first study. Now, this was one study. This was with a student sample. So while we can get a sense that these relationships exist, it was important for us to determine whether these results were robust. Would we continue to see these effects, especially if we were to go and talk to other people? Thus, we ran a second study. As this was a confirmatory study, this was pre-registered on the Open Science Framework website. We recruited 400 American full-time employees on Prolific, which is a platform where you pay people to complete surveys. And we had a final sample of 329 based on the same exclusion criteria as the last one. 52.6% identified as men, 46.2% identified as women, and 1.2% identified as non-binary, 65.1% identified as being white, and on average, they were 33.99 years old with 11.73 years of work experience. We did the same procedure basically as study one. The main difference was that we took out that environmental condition, given we saw the comparison effects that we expected last time, and therefore it looked to be, it was specifically because men were advocating for gender equality. And it was, again, the same procedure, mostly in comparison to study one. I say mostly as there was a technical error. So, and we didn't have the measures for leadership effectiveness and promotability shown to participants. They only could therefore rate applicants on rewards and penalties. However, we did see similar results as to last time, even with this different sample again. Specifically, as you can see here, men were rated as more communal when they were known to be an advocate for gender equality versus not being an advocate. There's no significant difference across female applicants. And similar to before, we did see this indirect effect. Please note, we only had the 2 DVs this time. And I will note, we only did see one significant indirect effect, that is on career-related penalties. So our hypotheses were partially supported in the second study. So to take away from those, what we can know from those 2 studies alone is that we saw that when men were known as an advocate for gender equality versus not known, this led to increased communality perceptions. And this in turn was related to positive career outcomes. Across both studies, we particularly saw that this was related to being recommended for more career-related rewards. And this pattern was specific to men and not women. The theoretical contributions that this work brings so far is that counter to past research, we demonstrate how men's advocacy for others may lead to positive work outcomes, whereas past research has focused on negative work outcomes or just neutral. There's no difference in whether you're an advocate or not. And part of why we may see these positive work outcomes in our context is the fact that we're focusing specifically on gender equality, so that in this case, men may be seen as not necessarily benefiting from it. And because they're seen as not necessarily benefiting, and rather that their work would be benefiting others, they will be seen as more communal. We actually introduced communality as a mechanism into the literature regarding being involved in diversity initiatives or male allyship. So that's really cool. And that's what allows us to see those positive work outcomes. And through introducing communality as a mechanism and seeing these effects occur in this context, we add to the emerging work showing that when men are shown to be more communal, they receive positive outcomes. Now, the exciting part, or why are we doing this work in the first place? The practical contributions. So part of why we did this work and why we were exploring this is we wanted to see, how do we encourage men to advocate for gender equality? We're hoping to disseminate the results of this work, and we're hoping that as we can let men know that they're not going to necessarily be penalized if they advocate for gender equality, we hope that will encourage them to do so more. And we also think it'll be helpful for organizational initiatives to involve men in those working towards gender equity. Something else, though, that's important that we saw in our work is that women and men are treated differently when involved in gender equity initiatives. And it's kind of ironic if men are rewarded and actually receive better career outcomes if known to be advocates for gender equality when women are not. That's mildly working against the point of these kinds of initiatives. Hence, by pointing out these kinds of results, we hope organizations will keep this in mind, especially when evaluating candidates. And well, the one thing is, while we hope that this work provides cool insights for both theory and practice, we still recognize there are limitations and that there's future work to be done. First of all, our experiments were set in a masculine job context. People were looking at these applicants for a financial manager position. And we recognize that this is important to note because jobs can be seen as more masculine or more feminine, and that can actually affect how traits are valued. So future work should consider more masculine or feminine contexts, be that with the job, be that with the organization, because that can affect how this work is valued and also whether the people will receive the same outcomes. A future direction I'm really excited for is the fact that we need to consider other factors. So for instance, we saw for women, those who advocated for the environment were seen as the most communal. Yet it's funny because you would think men and women would be who are advocating for the environment are equally potentially helping themselves and others. So that's something to consider and to explore more. And another factor that I really want to get into is considering the racial identities of the advocates and how that affects evaluations. This work focused on gender stereotypes, yet as we know, people may face racial stereotypes, and also there are different racialized gender stereotypes. So that's important to consider, and those are next steps for this project. But the conclusion you can take away from these two studies that I presented were that we saw, counter to beliefs, men who advocate for gender equality may receive positive and not negative career outcomes. And with this, I encourage others to hopefully encourage men to engage meaningfully in gender equity initiatives. Thank you for listening to me present my research. I welcome any questions or feedback. I'm guessing later on in this session. Please feel free to otherwise email me or to reach out through Twitter. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to seeing the last presentation for today before discussing all of this more with everyone.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Ashley. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a PhD candidate in the Gender, Feminist, and Women's Studies department here at York University. Today I will be presenting my paper, Representation, Diversity, and Inclusion in STEM, an intersectional analysis of women's experiences. In this presentation today, I wish to discuss the importance of women in the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields, and more importantly, the importance of an intersectional analysis in examining women's experiences. As I will show in this presentation, intersectionality adds nuance and moves away from a single axis analysis and thus it is not possible to examine and discuss women's experiences without considering this framework and the multiple forms of oppression some women experience. Before moving into the importance of women in STEM and the application of an intersectional framework to understand women's experience in these fields, I wish to clarify why I chose an intersectional framework and its importance to my research. Let me begin by stating that early feminist scholars who theorized, examined, and analyzed women's lives and work were anything but inclusive. They focused mostly on white middle-class women, and in fact, Crenshaw stated in her 1989 article that, quote, Black women were sometimes excluded from feminist theory, end quote. Therefore, unlike early feminist frameworks, an intersectional framework allows for examining experiences that early feminist theory overlooked, quote, combats feminist hierarchy, hegemony, and exclusivity, end quote, and rejects the single axis framework taken up by some feminist scholars. That said, I wish to also acknowledge that while my research will necessarily be limited because of my focus on gender, race, and class, intersectionality cannot and should not encompass all identities in its analysis. In my own application of an intersectional framework, I recognize that many important identities are not examined, such as sexual orientation and ability, to just name a few. However, including an exhaustive list of the countless overlapping identities is beyond this paper's scope, and it's just not possible. And I want to go back, and I want to go to Nash's sort of argument that intersectionality actually invites scholars to come to terms with legacy of exclusion of multiplied marginalized subjects from feminist and anti-racist work, and the impact of those absences on both theory and practice. In the next few slides, I engage with ideas of knowledge production and the double bind to discuss historical and ongoing exclusion in STEM fields. Specifically, I engage with questions of who gets to reproduce knowledge and how women were historically and still today left out of STEM fields. Feminist scholars such as Haraway, Harding, and Rosser have long examined the fact that scientific practices in knowledge production are anything but objective, with science being tarnished by gender-based inclusions. In thinking specifically about women's participation and experiences in STEM, feminists have critiqued the fact that science confused the masculine with the human ideal, with women seen as the other and never the producers of knowledge. Furthermore, feminist scholars like Harding have argued that women were systemically excluded from doing serious science, and she showcases how the sciences were used for racist, sexist, and classist social projects. For instance, Harding argues that, quote, oppressive reproductive policies, white men's management of women's domestic labor, gender discrimination in the workplace, all these have been justified on the basis of sexist research and maintained through technologies developed out of this research that move control of women's life from the women to men of the dominant group, end quote. All of this demonstrates that men were seen as valid producers of knowledge producers while women were excluded from knowledge production. However, beyond women's exclusion from knowledge production, the sciences were used to justify their exclusions from STEM fields altogether and keep them within the home. The effects of a white masculine ideal in the sciences have ongoing consequences for women in terms of representation and for the scientific world as a whole. This is a point I expand on later in this presentation. As mentioned earlier, feminist analysis of women's experiences and knowledge production centered around white women and their battles with gender equity, patriarchy, and sexism. Hence, employing an intersectional framework here to examine women's experiences in STEM moves away from that and shows that we cannot overlook the role of race and class when thinking about the effects of gender inequity, sexism, and patriarchy on women's experiences and advancement in these fields. Through an examination of the double bind, which is the idea that women of color are more likely to experience discrimination based on both their race and gender, I show how some women of color face both racism and sexism and the effect this has on their participation in STEM. For example, women of color indicate feeling alienated, isolated, and are discouraged from faculty from continuing in their studies, which is due in part because the culture of science is identified with notions of whiteness and masculinity. Furthermore, because of this double bind, women of color are seen as the least valued and most invisible of all underrepresented groups in STEM. As this demonstrates, an intersectional analysis is needed in order to show how gender inequities are amplified once we consider other forms of oppression, such as race, ethnicity, and class. Representation in STEM is needed for future innovations, diversity, and knowledge production, with the underrepresentation of women of color having dire consequences on STEM fields in terms of racial diversity. For instance, the underrepresentation of women of color results in a lack of mentors available to other racialized women pursuing STEM careers. This affects young women's decision to enter or even stay in these fields as they do not see themselves represented. Therefore, diversifying the workplace and addressing the issues of women's underrepresentation is beneficial for STEM fields. However, this begs the question of what needs to be done to bring about more representation and what we can do to achieve more diversity. Beyond the consequences underrepresentation has on STEM fields and society more broadly, underrepresentation is also a social issue affecting women and racialized minorities. STEM fields tend to produce higher paying jobs than non-STEM fields, and therefore the underrepresentation of women, and specifically racialized women in these fields, could, quote, increase labor market inequality along the race and gender lines, end quote. Thus, having more women in STEM careers is needed for better innovation and diversity and could decrease the gender gap in society. In this final section of the presentation, I argue that systemic and institutional changes are needed to make STEM fields more diverse, inclusive, and equitable. This includes moving beyond simply getting more racialized women into STEM and moving towards making sure there are higher rates of retention. In the following slides, I will talk about why an individual encouragement of women will not bring about representation and diversity in STEM, followed by a detailed examination of the changes to policies needed in STEM fields. In thinking about my previous discussion on the effects women's underrepresentation in STEM will have on these fields and society more broadly, I end this presentation with a discussion of what needs to be done to increase women's representation in these fields, which will subsequently lead to more diversity. There have been claims in the literature that women's underrepresentation in STEM is due to personal choice, and that the only solution is to, quote, increase the numbers and improve academic preparation of girls and young women in science and mathematics, end quote. This argument, however, assumes that women's underrepresentation is an individual problem, and that by encouraging individual women, we will see an increase of representation. However, we cannot look at individual women in order to bring about changes to STEM fields, as the problem is not with the women, but rather, as Rosser says, the institution of science as currently practiced. Thus, instead, I argue we must advocate for change. We must examine and bring changes to the institution, since it is institutional barriers that have prevented and continue to prevent women from an equal playing field, and culture and structural influences must also be examined. However, this again leads me to ask what these changes actually look like and what do they consist of. We cannot expect women to fit into the masculine culture of STEM as it currently is. Rather, STEM fields must change to accommodate women. Women are far more likely, for example, to take on domestic and childcare responsibilities. And this affects their ability to participate in STEM fully, and sometimes it even results in their complete departure from these fields. This is also true for women of color who cite struggles with career-life balance as a reason for their underrepresentation in STEM, though very little research has focused on how career-life balance issues affect women of color differently than their white counterparts. Given these social inequalities that hinder women's participation, I argue that the only way to change STEM fields is by bringing changes to policies and implementing new ones, which are needed in order to keep women in these fields and ensure better retention. For example, some of these new and improved policies can include family-friendly policies that will provide flexible scheduling, family and sick leave, and childcare. However, I do note here that beyond family-friendly policies, which are limited in their approach to helping and recognizing racialized women's experiences and barriers, different types of policies are needed for creating change in STEM fields, such as urging institutions to include employment and promotion policies and better policies that deal with overt discrimination and harassment. These policies will ensure women have the opportunity to pursue a career without sacrificing their personal or family time and protect women against sexual harassment and gender or racial discrimination. Furthermore, these policies can help with the gender segregation in STEM due to social and cultural influences and address what institutions could do to become more inclusive and supportive of all women's retention. So I want to end today with some concluding thoughts. So as I said, an intersectional framework is needed in order to examine women's experiences in STEM, as it provides an inclusive analysis of women's barriers and reminds us that race plays a role in women's experiences. Furthermore, an intersectional framework allows for examining race in conjunction with gender and class, moving away from a single axis framework taken out by previous feminist scholars who examined women's experiences and barriers, such as dealing with sexism, patriarchy, and much more. Thus, as Crenshaw has argued, an analysis that does not include an intersectional framework cannot properly address the experiences of women of color. I wish to also acknowledge that scientific knowledge is anything but objective, with feminist scholars arguing that women were left out of knowledge production. Racist and sexist ideologies contribute to women's, and especially racialized women's, participation in STEM fields. These ideologies continue to hinder women's participation and achievement in STEM fields, showcasing the need for more diversity and representation. Along with the conversation around intersectionality, gender, and race, this paper engages with the value of representation and how the underrepresentation of women of color would affect racial diversity and the future of STEM fields. As Shapiro and Sachs put it so eloquently, women's underrepresentation in STEM signifies a loss of potential talent and innovation. Hence, women are needed in these fields. However, this left me asking what changes are required and what policies must be implemented to bring about representation and diversity. Finally, this presentation engaged with my question of what needs to change in order for women to enter and stay in STEM fields. Specifically, systemic changes are necessary to bring about representation, diversity, and inclusion in STEM. And this is only possible by implementing new policies. Encouraging and looking at individual women's progress is not the solution. Thank you so much for listening. And if there are any questions, please let me know.